I'd like to welcome Brian OKennedy to the stage, and just while Brian is getting himself all set, all the Future In series have always been a very interactive series of events, so just looking for your questions. My text line is still open there if you want to use it, and likewise the chat line is open, but you do need to get your questions in, otherwise I get to ask all the questions. So, now, Brian, as chair of CDP Ireland, over to you.
Thank you, Conor. Brian OKennedy is my name. I'm not Gary from Rostera. He's much younger and better looking than I am, so apologies to anybody who came along to hear Gary. I'm here to talk to you this morning about a much more exciting topic of carbon emissions. And the reason for it, very simply, I'll give you one compelling reason, and that's because the biggest retailer in the world is asking you to measure and report your carbon emissions. So I'd like to go on a little journey around. I'm going to step back a small bit first and talk to you broadly about sustainability, and then work our way around to carbon emissions. Before I do, by way of introduction, my own background, as Conor said, I run the CDP Ireland network, which is a group set up to help companies to report their emissions. But I have a dark past. I worked in supply chain for over 20 years, where I pumped out lots of dreadful stuff, mostly for the IT industry. In fact, at one stage, for a quarterly release of software, we made enough CDs to stretch the whole way from Belfast to Cork and back. I've no idea where all those CDs are, probably in some I suppose, landfill at this stage. So in terms of the transformation and how I got here today, well, we were asked as part of a tender for probably the biggest print project that was ever secured in the history of the state here in Ireland, it was the Scottish census. The Scots, fortunately, are a little ahead of us in many of these areas, and as part of this tender over 10 years ago, they asked us about our carbon emissions and the sustainability of our processes. And frankly, for most Irish companies 10 years ago, that was a question that they didn't have a clue how to go about answering. So we busily, over 3 months of the tender, got our act together, and as I say, that sparked off my original interest in sustainability, and still to this day, obviously, for many of us, is a big driver in terms of our sustainability. So I'm going to talk about linking sustainability to carbon management and what those relationships are. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Carbon Disclosure Project and about the CDP network in Ireland. And then finally, a little bit about carbon demystified, because people talk about their carbon emissions and carbon reporting, and a lot of people, frankly, don't understand the basics. So we'll just do a little bit of back to teaching. Now, in fairness to the Minister, he did address the large elephant in the room, but unfortunately, those of you who read the newspaper this morning will understand that and heard about what our Taoiseach said at the COP talks. We still really, as a country, have not grasped the opportunity here that exists for Ireland. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the reasons why climate change is so critical, and particularly for the food industry. So we've seen a little bit of momentum recently, coming from some unusual sources. I think Eva mentioned the fact that she went back 10 years ago, people laughed at sustainability. I'm sure if you said 10 years ago that these three people would be making some very significant pronouncements about climate change and the impact on our society, you'd be very surprised to hear that. But it's great to see this momentum. Whether it will go on through COP or not will be most interesting. I mean, you have the Pope talking about human-induced climate change, a scientific reality. Its decisive mitigation is a moral and religious imperative for humanity. Prince Charles only yesterday said that climate change threatens our ability to feed ourselves, to remain healthy and safe from extreme weather, to manage the natural resources that support our economies, and to avert the humanitarian disaster of mass migration and increasing conflict. This is a topic we're increasingly hearing more about through conflicts in the Middle East, and in particular Syria. There's a great video on the BBC which you can have a look at about farming in Syria and what's happened there. And finally, Barack Obama. The Americans are finally recognizing this significant issue here. No challenge poses a greater threat to future generations than climate change. Unfortunately, we still have some challenges, and I sent this gentleman a letter a few years ago. Actually, I sent him a nice book. It was called The Triple Bottom Line, which I don't know if any of you have read, but it was extolling the virtues of a balanced approach to business from environmental, social, and financial. And he kindly wrote back to me saying that it would make a nice addition to his wood-fired stove over the Christmas holidays, and that essentially this was the gobbledygook peddled by the climate change loonies. I can tell you I'm not a climate change loony, but I am a businessman, and I believe that firmly that this is a significant issue for us as we try to drive competitive advantage in our business. Traditional approach was, well, here in Ireland, 2 degrees wouldn't be too bad, extra little bit of warming, and you know, we've got enough bad weather here. So, but I think most people are realizing now that that's an immature view of what we're addressing, and that even if you don't believe in it, the possible risk that something might have such a catastrophic effect on the way we live on this planet, we take insurance out for risks that are significantly smaller. So I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted here today, but if you haven't got the message by now, this is a massive, significant issue, not just for our business, but for our livelihoods. Some practical examples. I have a friend who runs a production facility in Poland. And over the summer, he had to give up on a big project, big order, because the Polish government were rationing energy because of the heat. Another colleague of mine who's in the States, running a drinks business at another brewery, he ran into significant issues over water production in the summer. They've had droughts for the last 4 years. Pollution in Asia. Great pictures this morning again, and there's an Irish family living in China, and they're wearing gas masks most of the time. So massive issues around pollution. We are the only organism on this planet that has managed to find a way to dig stuff out of the ground and destroy it. Every other organism, and most of you in the food business, you understand this, finds a way to manage a circular economy. So it has to change. What are the issues? Well, there's so many varied issues around sustainability. Obviously, the Origin Green program does a wonderful job at helping us to define those sort of into a structured approach to sustainability management. But we are seeing some new issues. We've had this migration, obviously. We've had significant drought, political instability, hurricanes. More recently, issues such as modern slavery, although I don't know why they call it modern slavery. It's been around. It's only modern because we found out about it. But social media and the media generally now allows us to expose these issues. Sourcing of materials and where they're coming from. We're running a sustainable supply chain seminar after lunch today. If any of you are going to be talking about this issue of visibility and traceability in the supply chain. And migration, as I mentioned, a huge issue for us, not just in terms of our ability to integrate the migrants, but also in terms of ability to be able to feed and support people as they travel around the world. So big, complex issue. So where in all this dreadful trouble and strife does the opportunity for Ireland arise? Well, essentially, it's good business. So fundamentally, companies that are well run and companies that understand their issues around sustainability are good businesses. And the investors have figured this out. And through many studies, there is a correlation between businesses that are more successful, i.e. are more profitable, better return on investment, and those that are engaged in sustainability. Now, whether that's a cause or effect is unclear. I mean, there's probably an issue that those who are well-run and more profitable can afford to spend more in this area, or whether it's the other way around, that they're driving profitability through investment. But one way or another, there is a correlation. There is money to be saved. If you haven't heard, we've had some excellent examples here this morning of how we can save money in this area. There are jobs. The SCAI have estimated that in Ireland alone, an additional 10,000 jobs can be driven from this sector. And finally, and probably most importantly for this organisation, there is the opportunity for Ireland and Ireland's products to be branded as the most sustainable products in the world. And as I said, I was a little disappointed this morning to hear that we're apologising that we won't hit our targets. I think that misses the message. The message is that we are going to be and should be putting our hands up and saying this country can be the most sustainable location for food production anywhere in the world, and that we're going to do it based on a per unit basis or what other factors that we're measuring and reporting, So it should be a very positive message around Ireland and Ireland's image. Essentially, it all comes down to competitive advantage from a business perspective. And there are many opportunities for us to drive competitive advantage. And I'm going to come on to talk about where the benefits from that arises. One really good example is where we're sitting as we speak. This organization has been quietly going about, from an operations perspective, delivering massive savings here in Croke Park, from their gas to electricity to water, all through a sustainability program. It's not Origin Green, but it's a similar ISO standard 20121. And they have used the standard and the achievements here in Croke Park to go and sell the product internationally. And again, Ireland is a location not just for food and venues, but also for holidays and as I said, conferences. So it's a key part of building up the infrastructure and image of Ireland as a leader in sustainability. So back on to what gets measured and gets done and the CDP. So it's great to hear people talking about measuring and reporting and all of that. But in the end of the day, what you measure and you report, the measurement is only the first part of it. What do you do with it? So I want to give you a small piece about an organization called CDP. I don't know, just a quick show of hands, how many of you have heard of CDP before, or the Carbon Disclosure Project? I'm talking to a very educated audience, okay, so it's over half of you have. So CDP is an organization that was driven and led by the investors. And the investors are your monies, your pension funds, and other financial institutions who measure and report. And when they're making financial decisions, they look at businesses and their sustainability performance. And they use the CDP platform, which is a carbon reporting platform, to assess the sustainability of those businesses. So short little video, I hope.
Whether it's plentiful water, a clean atmosphere, or protected forests, around the globe we're facing a huge decline in the world's natural capital. Although we're increasingly aware of the part we play in this, many organizations don't realize the financial risk it poses to their operations and supply chains. So, what can be done? To prevent dangerous climate change, protect our natural resources, and minimize risk, accountability is paramount. In order to manage, we must measure. At CDP, we harness market forces to drive change by providing the only global system for the disclosure of environmental information. It helps to motivate thousands of companies and cities to measure, disclose, and manage environmental risks and opportunities. For companies and cities, CDP drives awareness of where to make strategic changes in order to increase efficiency, save money, and capitalize on commercial opportunities. It also builds competitive advantage and resilience. For investors and procurement teams, the information enables analysis of long-term risks and opportunities so that better investment decisions can be made. But it doesn't stop there. Policymakers and academics all benefit from these crucial insights. And it's working. Disclosing to CDP gave Walmart the insight to focus on reducing its refrigerant footprint after learning that it made up a larger percentage of the company's greenhouse gas emissions than its truck fleet. It helped Boeing to advance its strategies and set performance targets for carbon management. It even enabled Allergan to develop a 10-year vision to reduce water consumption by 50% by 2020. And they're not alone. Already, 81% of the Global 500 report through us, informing investors representing more than a third of the world's invested capital. CDP is catalyzing change. Over the last 3 years, the number of Global 500 companies that have integrated climate change into their business strategy has jumped by over 60%. CDP data points are now downloaded on Bloomberg terminals an average of 1 million times every 6 weeks. And we've only just started. Be a part of it. Visit cdp.net or follow us on Twitter @CDP.
So just a little bit about CDP in Ireland. We there are about 2,000 companies globally reporting, of whom about 170 of them report emissions here in Ireland. So a lot of big multinationals are reporting emissions from Ireland. We have 28 companies who are Irish registered companies who are reporting, and amongst them some of the largest food companies in the country. But it's not just the preserve of the large companies. It doesn't cost money to report. You don't pay to CDP to report. So there are a number of smaller voluntary organisations. So for instance, Bewley's, the Bewley's organisation tends to report, has reported to CDP. We have 2 companies who are on the A list, and there's only 117 companies worldwide on the A list, and that's Kingspan and Accenture. And increasing trends, the CDP also allows companies to report and disclose their water and forestry footprint, also very important for the food industry. And finally, the supply chain, and this is a really interesting area, is where large multinationals, such as Walmart, are asking their suppliers to disclose their emissions to CDP. And in fact, I don't know if any of you recognize this, but this is the Walmart's 15 questions, that sustainability questions that they ask their suppliers. I'll make the eye test a little bit easier. The first 2 questions are, have you measured your corporate greenhouse emissions, and have you opted to report your greenhouse gas emissions to the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP? So whether you have or you haven't, this is what Walmart are asking for, and that is going to drive competition. And if you're not doing it, your competitors on a global basis will be. Again, the rationale and why they're doing it, well, they figure that cutting carbon cuts cost, and they're absolutely right. Carbon is a nice cross-section of all of the elements of cost and sustainability, whether it's fuel or energy or water or waste or transportation. It's a great way of capturing all of those issues. So reduce carbon and you reduce your cost. Legislation is while we don't have, well, we're about to have climate change legislation in this country, but there are no binding targets. But many of the companies and countries that you're competing with have. So in the UK, for instance, there's a CRC reporting scheme. And for large companies of over 500 people or 50 million in turnover, from 2017, there will be a mandatory requirement for you to publish non-financial information in your annual accounts. And that will include your carbon emissions. The business opportunities we talked about, the big retailers asking the question, but also the suppliers, working with your suppliers to remove cost. Carbon is the currency by which that analysis can be carried out. And finally, shareholders and investors. So whether you're a large company or a small company, people will increasingly be asked as to whether your business is at risk from the impacts of climate change, be they regulatory or climatic. So what is a carbon footprint? Well, it's the measure of an environmental performance in the business, and it's measured in terms of the greenhouse gas potentials. I'm not going to get into that too much, but just to mention that there are two different basically types of emissions reporting, and one is your organizational footprint. And most of what you hear people here report is we've reduced our emissions. That's their organizational footprint, and typically they're looking at scope 1 and scope 2 there. The product footprint is another a more complex area of carbon emissions reporting, and it tends to be where companies look into the life cycle of their product. It's a much more scientific analysis, and I guess there's lots of different thoughts as to whether that's at one stage they looked at product labeling and footprinting, but it's less common. But again, nonetheless, very insightful if you have products or packaging, for instance, or materials that you want to assess the performance of those from an environmental perspective. So what does carbon look like? Well, the EPA have produced a wonderful little video, actually, which doesn't look like it's going to play, is it? Or maybe it is. Excuse me for... Yeah. So this is the amount of greenhouse gases that Ireland adds to the atmosphere every day. They're the towers down in Ringsend. 160,000 tonnes. And they've calculated this because they've measured the size of a carbon atom and then basically grown it up into everything else. I live in Sandymount, and I'm a bit perturbed enough about the size of the new incinerator. It's a lot taller than I'd expected, but that's a pretty significant little graphic. That's every day. That's what we pump out as a little country. Scope 1, direct emissions coming from your company-owned materials. So anything you burn in your business, fuel, gas, or anything combusted on site. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions, typically purchased electricity or steam. Scope 3 is where, for many of us, there's a significant additional cost in our businesses. It's from transport, it's from waste, it's from water, product use, outsourced activities in our business. And again, huge opportunities there for us to eliminate costs from our business. I'll skip through this briefly, but there are protocols, there are measures, there are tools, and global best practice. And the typical emissions, starting out is sometimes the most difficult part. People say, well, how do I start? Well, you start by capturing the basic data. Carbon factors are widely available, and you multiply those by your output. The carbon footprint in itself doesn't mean a lot, so companies should tend to measure it in terms of an intensity factor, whether it's the output of your business, the turnover of your business, the number of employees, or some other such measure in terms of assessing the relativity of your performance. Once you've measured, then you have a bunch of options, so you can decide obviously to try and reduce those emissions. A lot of companies are increasingly putting a price of carbon in their own business, maybe in anticipation of something that's going to come out of COP21, but maybe not. But it's a very good way of providing a discipline in the business that all of your investments are measured in terms of carbon emissions. Or finally, you can choose to offset, and offset through ideally a reputable scheme that delivers some other social benefit. And finally, once you've done all that, then you should communicate, and we're back full circle. So the communication is you report to schemes such as CDP, or you tell people about what you're doing, or your employees. There are voluntary schemes out there, and obviously you're part of a voluntary scheme, which is the Origin Green program. But CDP, anybody who's interested in reporting their emissions to CDP and using that logo and the branding benefits. There are also the mandatory schemes that I mentioned, as EU ETS if you're a very large organisation, and we're seeing more and more mandatory reporting. So finally, there's the 7 steps. So you set your scope and objectives, you identify the hotspots and measure to a standard, identify the hotspots in your business, have your emissions verified and reduced, and then you embed low carbon culture engagement with your employees. It's a great way to bring in your employees and your suppliers and other stakeholders. Then you can look to offset and finally communicate. So that's hopefully giving you an insight into the carbon emissions space and why we should be reporting. And if anybody's interested in talking about CDP, I'll be around for the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian.